I was going to make a couple of comments before I start. Is that I read a very interesting article written in 1991 by Peter Drucker about productivity, who said that the challenge in the services sector was to increase productivity in the same way that manufacturing had. And when you go home tonight, maybe you could think of how could you increase your productivity by a factor of 50 to 1, which is what manufacturing has done over the last 150 years. Because I can't, but apparently that's what we have to do. And the second point is that he made is that fundamentally knowledge workers have to take responsibility for their own productivity, which is an interesting way of looking at telework or working anywhere. Because if you take that hypothesis, then there's no problem. Anyway, I'll just say a little bit about our new digital productivity and services flagship. It's basically there to address the issue of productivity within the services sector. Productivity in the services sector is basically very dominant now because we're 80% of the economy. So it doesn't matter how well manufacturing does, if services do not improve productivity, then the nation as a whole cannot improve its productivity. In the last 10 years, things have not been very good. So there's a big push to improve productivity. So the goal of the flagship is to grow productivity, but there's a few other goals, and I'll show you there. Is things about innovation and efficiency. One of the important goals there is to unlock the value of broadband communications, because the flagship has been formed just at a time when the broadband is rolling out. So that's quite a significant part of what we're trying to do, and obviously telework is a big part of that. There's also some other goals, but at the end of the day, we're trying to add value to the Australian economy. And we've got a bit of a catchphrase there, but ultimately I think we're looking at doing things differently. So obviously telework is one of the areas where we're either doing something that we used to do in a new way, or maybe we're going to do something completely differently. It depends on how our imagination takes us. Because I think when we talk telework, we often think working at home, but I work in an organisation where my boss is in Brisbane and I virtually never see her. So am I teleworking or am I not? My customers are not in my office, my boss isn't in my office, a lot of my reports are not in my office, so actually I'm teleworking from my office. Well, how does that work? So I think you've got to think a bit more. So it's a question of saying that you're sort of triangulating between your customers, your management structure and yourself. And if you're remote from both of those, or one of those, potentially you are working anywhere. And certainly I spend most of my time working anywhere. So we've taken on this productivity basically because we believe that with the services economy being 80%, we cannot ignore it. When I first came to CSRO, I said, I've got about 3% of the CSRO staff working for me, and yet I represent 80% of the economy. Something isn't quite right. Okay, so we're gradually crawling towards a more balanced view, I think. And I agree with everyone that says manufacture is important, but at the end of the day, 80% is a big number. If we get that wrong, it doesn't matter what we do in manufacturing and mining, it's all over. And the other observation I would make is that if we really get anybody working, does that person even have to be working in Australia? It's an interesting concept, is that if you can work from anywhere, then maybe you're not even working in Australia. Maybe the people who work for you are not in Australia, maybe your competitors are not in Australia. So it gets very interesting once you start taking this a little bit further. So the sorts of things we're bringing to this debate is sort of really three areas. One is very much on the evidence-based policy and decision support. So that's using data and as much information as possible to disseminate whether these things work, using benchmark techniques and that sort of thing to say, how can we use the evidence to inform and guide the debate. Service delivery transformation is fairly straightforward. It's about services innovation. But the one I would mention is this whole idea of customer-centric services. It's wrapping yourself around the customer. Because once you break out of this idea that we're all in the office and the customer's over there, you can wrap yourself around the customer in a much more effective way. So it breaks down this divide. And ultimately, I think it will be a triangulation between your customer, your organisation and yourself. And it's not that simple where it all fits, and for different organisations it will be different. And I think that's one of the challenges in the future, is you can't just get a one-size-fits-all model and say that's the way it's done. Believe me, I do work for banks, I work for government departments, and I can say that the banks are embracing this working anywhere. Anyone who goes to CBA at Darling Harbour, apart from the trading room, there are no offices. Everybody sits around with their wireless laptops drinking coffee. So they've almost taken that to the furthest degree possible without sort of people falling asleep or watching TV. So there's a different approach from different companies. But the sorts of things we're doing in this space, and that's what I want to come on to, is we're looking at things like design of experiment and analysis, so that we can when we look at things, we can say, okay, have we collected the right data? Have we created the correct experiment? It doesn't mean to say that these experiments have to be overly complicated. It's just really working out what you need to achieve before and after. And I would actually pick up something Yvette said about this whole idea of the value of asking people, what did you expect to happen? That's a very interesting question. It guides you to pointing, because people, we're doing some work with the broadband rollout, which I'll come on to later, and one of the questions is, well, what do you expect to happen? Because that actually focuses you in on what you want to measure. So people are actually a lot more switched on than you think. And the sorts of difficult things we're trying to do is things like measuring innovation or measuring quality of life or measuring productivity. And these are not easy things to do. And if they were easy, it would have all been done before. And I think this all fits back into the productivity and the working anywhere debate. Because you can't measure these things, then you can't really draw any sensible conclusions. But I thought I'd spend just a couple of minutes talking about some projects which we're doing. One which is with, we formed this thing called the Australian Centre for Broadband Innovation. It's really New South Wales government, the federal government, saying, okay, well, we've got this thing called the broadband. How can we work out what it's doing for us? Or how can we work out how it could do things for us? And we're doing a project which is, compared to the number of researchers, is very grand, which is looking at trying to work out the benefits to society and the economy as the broadband rolls out, which is proving to be an incredibly difficult problem. But the theory goes that we're going to work out from the first rollout what the broad impacts are, and then we'll work out from that what we would have measured had we started there. And then the final thing is to work out through design of experiment to help the various stakeholders make small, if you like, nudge economic changes, such that by spending a bit more here or a bit more there or doing this or doing that, the value of the broadband rollout will be leveraged much more so than it would have been if we had done nothing. One example is that local councils are giving grants, but the question is it the right grant? Are they doing the right things with the money? Could they do something differently? So I think there's great value in being able to say, okay, we've spent a lot of money on this rollout. We haven't, with all due respect to everyone involved, we haven't spent an awful lot on change management, which typically you would with a technology rollout. So the question is, if we're going to spend a very limited amount of money on change management and change in behaviours, where would we spend that money to get even more leverage from the future rollout of the broadband? So it's a very interesting thing. It's and we're looking at things like new business models, delivery of government services, and obviously teleworking is a very good use case. I think it's probably, apart from, in terms of real benefit to society, apart from maybe on the health sector, teleworking I think is going to be one of the big use cases where big gains are made from the broadband. Because although people had broadband before, it wasn't symmetric, it wasn't necessarily high speed, it wasn't necessarily reliable. So those are the things that it gives you. So you've almost got a home office with your VPN that you can do everything you need to do. The second interesting one that's got an element of telework, which is the Future Service Delivery Project. We're doing some work with Department of Human Services, which used to be called Centrelink. We've been working for them for about 3 years on a very big project. And one of the most recent projects is really grappling with the idea of how are we going to do services in an area where, for example, everyone's got a tablet, everyone's got a high-speed broadband, all the staff have got high-speed broadband, and how is that going to change the way we do things? So it's not so much, it's if you like, telework on steroids, because it's jumping right through from the individual almost to the customer. To say, okay, well, the customer's going to be consuming services anywhere. The officer is going to be delivering services anywhere. And the organisation is going to support that in some way, which is very different to what they've done before. There's massive benefits because the whole model of home visits potentially will change. The whole model of the way they keep tabs on people will change. So they'll be able to, using this sort of thing, plus with maybe analytics, they'll be able to identify very much quicker the sorts of people who need services. So from my perspective, what we're looking for is obviously services productivity. So we're looking for opportunities to improve what I might call labour productivity. There's obviously the subservient benefit there in terms of capital productivity, in terms of the basic office space and so on. But I think there's another thing that's been touched on before, which is the whole work-life experience, which needs to be thought about. And the quality of life is not just on the people which are impacted by the ability to work anywhere, but the impact on their families maybe, and the impact on the community, and whether going to work every day or not going to work every day impacts the way people feel about themselves. So I think there's a lot of thought around that, because we can't just push this on people, get the managers, get the people involved if the rest of the community is not on board. And I think it's been mentioned before, and I was amazed when New South Wales government released their infrastructure support. Not a word about the impact of new technology on the requirement for infrastructure. It's just a question, just put a few more rocks in, a bit more steel, that'll fix the problem. But the point is, if you look at school holidays, which is a very small percentage of people off the road, it makes a very big difference to traffic jams. So imagine if we could take 10% of the people off the road, what a big difference that would make. Anyway, well, that's my concluding thought bubble. So, thank you.